Good evening from Odessa on the shores of the Black Sea. Behind me, you've got the Odessa Cathedral, and it's a poignant place, an appropriate place for me to film while in Odessa because overnight, up in the capital, Kyiv, we saw significant cultural and religious sites attacked by Putin, by Russia. So in today's live stream, I'm going to discuss what all this means. As you can see from the title, to me, it indicates the increasing desperation by the Putin regime with respect to the direction of the Russo-Ukrainian war and their own grip on power in the Russian Federation in Moscow. So to sum up last night's attacks, there were close to 700 drone attacks on Ukraine and 70 ballistic missile attacks. Ukrainian air defense, from what they report, did increasingly well. They shut down 95% of the kamikaze drones and about 70% of the ballistic missiles. And that represents an increase in the ballistic missiles that were shot down. Previously, Ukraine stated that they were shooting down just 30%. They did certainly receive some interceptors recently, and presumably that's what they used yesterday. Otherwise, the destruction would have been even greater. Some of the non-military objects that were hit yesterday include the Lavra, the religious center in Kyiv, which has a series of monasteries and other religious buildings. Picturesque Lavra is the name. It is a major tourist attraction in Kyiv and obviously a significant Christian religious site that was hit by not just one, but basically in that area, two drones hit buildings, also the Arsenal building. And also there were other cultural institutions that were hit, like there was some sort of national drama. I'm not sure if it's a museum or complex. And there they have a lot of, it was for the film institutes in Ukraine. And there apparently there were like huge number of costumes, like hundreds of thousands of them. And they were also significantly damaged. There were images of the curators of the Lavra trying to rescue artifacts and icons from the monasteries there this morning in the early hours of the morning. So clearly not an accident. You hit that number of cultural sites in one evening, and especially when we see the strike down rate by Ukrainian air defense, which was way higher on the ballistic missiles than previously, then we can deduct that this was clearly a targeted attack. Also in the eastern city of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, there was what's infamously dubbed as a double tap strike, where rescue services that showed up after an attack there were targeted and killed, and some of them were killed as well. That is a very typical terrorist tactic to basically try and hit a target twice in order to kill the first responders. It is something that the Russian Federation has consistently done here in Ukraine, particularly here in Odessa. So we see Putin targeting deliberately cultural institutions here in Ukraine and also use of more terrorism on first responders in the eastern city of Kharkiv. So is this unprecedented? Well, this cathedral was hit a few summers ago, might have been 2023. It was definitely way earlier in the war. And as you can see, it's, well, maybe you can't entirely see, but it's been restored since. Now, I'm not so sure they actually hit this on purpose, the Odessa Cathedral. Would have been very strange because it's actually previously very heavily connected to the Russian Federation and the Russian Orthodox Church. So it would be very odd to target, but who knows in this war. It also happens to be a reasonably high building in the center of Odessa, so maybe they hit it by accident. But what happened last night was not an accident. Almost certainly it was deliberate. So it's a little bit different to the attacks here back a few summers ago. It represents an increasing escalation and basically an admission by the Kremlin that they're not going to be able to capture Kyiv because otherwise they would want to preserve those religious monuments in the Ukrainian capital in order to have a parade around them and claim them as their own, which would have been part of the original plan back in 2022. However, targeting them and increasingly targeting these kind of buildings, whether it's the governmental buildings or the cultural buildings, is a sign that they basically accept that they're not going to be able to take Kyiv. So targeting it for destruction is something that they are now prioritizing. And it indicates that they are escalating because they continue to make almost no progress on the front lines. In fact, they're being rolled back. And the situation for them becomes more and more difficult in terms of their military campaign for several reasons, as I've said for many years. Manpower, money, and materiel. They are now negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan to get the over 40-year-old Soviet vehicles, to get them so they can refurbish them, that the Soviets left behind after the Soviet-Afghan war. That's how desperate they are for materiel. They can only produce so much with their economy, which is under increasing strain. They're in a recession. They're crowding out the rest of the economy. They are running out of manpower for the military. They now recruit less soldiers than they lose every month. Increasingly, it's becoming more and more difficult for them to get Russians to sign up for the military. They can offer more and more money, but that's obviously a problem if you're running out of money because the economy is in trouble. And as you can see, manpower, money, and material are three massive crises now for Russia. Same time, Ukraine has managed to innovate a lot quicker, and now they're also reforming their military. That was announced the other day. And they are at least laying the groundwork for a potential new offensive in the south of Ukraine by taking out a lot of the logistics and isolating the Crimean Peninsula, which has been under occupation since 2014. So on the battlefield, things have gone in reverse, basically, from what we've seen from 2023 to 2026. Russia is now incapable to make any progress on the battlefield. Still a little bit around Konstantinivka, that is the first city in a line of, I think there's about 5 cities in the fortress belt, and taking that would represent the entire fortress, but not just the one city, would give Russia a strategic achievement. I claim they managed to take control of the Donbass region. However, their only strategic achievement of this war, the land bridge Crimea, is now under threat because effectively it's been cut off, and it could even be retaken by Ukraine in a new offensive, a little bit what we saw in late 2022 with the Kharkiv Oblast offensive and recapturing the city of Kherson. And what I had expected to happen in 2023, which didn't come to pass. Ukrainians weren't able to make enough progress against the Surovikin line. However, 3 years later, technology and strategy and tactics have now evolved to make circumventing or overcoming those fortifications actually possible. And we'll have to see what Ukraine decides to do. Maybe it's going to be later this summer, maybe be early next year, if this war is still ongoing, that they would actually take that back and eliminate any strategic achievement by the Russian Federation during this phase of the war since 2022. So this represents desperation and increasing desperation on the part of Vladimir Putin, targeting these cultural institutions of the capital, Kyiv. For the first time, I'm seeing street interviews in Moscow, at least the first time since the beginning of the invasion, of Muscovites actually speaking out openly against the war. That represents, to me, that the Putin regime is weaker and weaker, because if people feel like they can actually criticize the government and the war and call it a war on camera, and apparently not that fearful of retribution, otherwise you wouldn't be able to get hardly anyone to do it, and definitely huge increase from before, it means that the surveillance state and the control that the Putin regime has in Moscow is weakening. It's the first time I've seen this. They tried recently to throttle the internet, take out VPNs, limiting internet on mobile phones in Moscow. It hasn't gone down well. People seem to be upset about that. And now you see increasingly that they had to roll that back a little bit. And maybe by showing that weakness, it's actually encouraging more people in Moscow to speak out against the war. It is kind of an interesting development. Haven't seen this since 2022. It again indicates that Putin is in a weaker and weaker position. The economy is getting weaker. The elites have less money to fight over, basically, and they're increasingly going to have to fight about it. And that will be the next phase that we will see in this endgame. I was at the Black Sea Security Conference. That was actually the title of it, was Endgame question mark. But we are in the endgame, and this attack on these cultural objects of Ukraine represents another piece of evidence that we are in an endgame, because this is what you would expect to see as the Kremlin runs out of options, that they would become increasingly more desperate and start to strike cultural and political symbols and objects in the capital, Kyiv, because they're running out of options. They cannot win on the battlefield. Their economy is maybe not going to collapse tomorrow, but it's already in recession. It's already crumbling slowly but surely, and they cannot get enough Russian citizens to sign up to the military to come die here in Ukraine for the glory of their imperialist leaders. So all of this we can unfortunately expect to continue. We will see more attacks like we saw last night, unfortunately, almost certainly in the coming weeks and months. It was something also that Nazi Germany focused on while they were losing World War II, even though it was actually counterproductive to any chance they had of turning the tide. If you start to target civilians and, you know, cultural objects, or they increased obviously their rate in the Holocaust and killing civilians, but that was all basically accelerating their own downfall, and Russia will be the same. So it will be very interesting in the coming months, because I don't think we're going to see any sort of ceasefire, at least until after these elections that will take place. It won't be real fair and free elections. However, it will be kind of a little bit of a referendum on the Putin regime to see how many Russians actually show up to vote voluntarily in the elections. Not that there will be any sort of real dissent, opposition there running on the ballot paper, but you know, going in, and I've watched some foreigners who are Russian propagandists, and they say they love voting in Russia because they already know the result, and they go and they give their approval to the absolute train wreck of what he's doing to their country, because they believe in apparently destroying Russia from with this stupid war that they launched. And yeah, we'll see how many Russians want to go and give that seal of approval while they get poorer, when they realize that their freedoms are being even reduced even further, and that the war is going in the wrong direction, and there is no light at the end of the tunnel for them. It is only more gloom and doom as they look forward to 2027. So I don't expect to see Russia go for a mobilization before those elections are over, and then Putin, presumably, I still leaning towards that he will go for the mobilization. He could also call a ceasefire. That would actually be the smarter thing to do at this point. But since he's been making bad strategic decisions consistently for the last 4.5 years, I will expect him to get bad information and bad advice from the sycophants around him, and for him to go for a mobilization in September, probably October 2026. This will continue on the war into 2027. And then I would expect it to at least come to a pause in 2027. Of course, Putin probably hasn't even made up his mind 100%. He may decide to go for a ceasefire in the meantime. But I would say that's less than 50%. I think it's more likely that he continue on and goes for mobilization and make him increasingly unpopular. It will undermine the legitimacy of his power in Moscow, and it will increase the chances of some sort of palace coup in 2027. I don't think we're at that stage yet. I don't see that much indication of infighting between different clans in the elites in Moscow yet to say that there's a incoming coup. And probably if I could figure out there's an incoming coup, then clearly Vladimir Putin would be aware of that and taking action to avoid it in any case. But to summarize, we saw another swath of heinous war crimes last night by the Russian Federation on the nation of Ukraine. But it is an indication that they are, another indication that they are losing this war and losing it increasingly quickly. And unfortunately, in the end game, which we are now in, this is what you would expect to see a tyrannical dictatorial regime with decreasing options resort to. And just like this cathedral was rebuilt and restored after it was hit by a Russian rocket back a few summers ago, Pechersk Lavra and the other buildings that were destroyed, they will be rebuilt in due course after Ukraine succeeds in this defense of its sovereignty in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So on that kind of more upbeat ending to this video, I'll let you go. I don't see any comments and questions so far in the live stream, so write them down below if you're watching this on replay. And of course, if you come to Ukraine, I have my guide for coming to Ukraine during the war down below. And also you can reach out to me for consulting advice. There's a link there as well. So I'll sign off and say до побачення, слава Україні, і до перемоги, because that is what is coming. And the disgraceful attacks of last night, the continuing attacks by the Russian Federation in the long arc of history will be seen in the same light as desperate attacks by Germany in the second half of World War II. And they will end up in the same position without a victory. And this country, Ukraine, will stand strong and succeed. So, ciao, ciao from Odessa Mama, and catch you in another video tomorrow.